Welcome back to Stab the Dragon Productions, an American Catechism for episode number 53 for the Defenders of the Faith Bible Studies for Patriots number 2 as we continue our exposition of Genesis 14 and look at Abram's Militia. Coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas on Friday, February 6th, 2026, where it is 80 degrees. Winter in Texas. Last time we looked at Genesis 14, we studied the background to the text and some of the first 12 verses, and we found that this text had some peculiarities that made it appear as if Moses had a non-Jewish source for this story from ancient history, which means that somebody 4,000 years ago or so thought that the incident with Abram and Lot was so significant, that Abram was such an amazing man, that the story needed preserving in a broader context, not just in Jewish history. And this helps display Abram's character as a mighty sheik, a warrior chieftain, and that exactly sets the stage for what we want to bring out from this Bible passage. Today we'll examine the war on the plain itself and follow the actions of the key players. Ever since Cain killed Abel, there's been violence, murder, and wars. And if you Google the question, how many wars are going on now, the answer is going to be 50 or over, a little bit over 50. War is an ever-present reality. The long war of Satan against God spills over from the spiritual realm into the physical and political realms. Times of peace and prosperity seem to be rare. Well, let's start by reading the passage from Genesis 14. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is, Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is, the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Imim in Shava Kiriathim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is, Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazon Tamar. Then the kings of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. That's enough for this time. So let's look some more at this war, the causes of the war first. This particular war was caused when the 5 kings of the plain rebelled against Chedorlaomer, hence on I'll call him Cheddar, right? In the 13th year of being ruled by him. We do not know the circumstances behind this rebellion. All we can do is kind of look at what was the norm for the time and guess. What was normal, and the text here seems to back it up, is that one kingdom that was quite powerful, with one king who was a strong leader, would take over several other smaller kingdoms and coerce them into being his vassals. This would mean that they have to pay tribute, or in modern terminology, taxes. And he would then they would be allied with him to help him out if he needed assistance in a war or trade. And this would be called a suzerain treaty between 2 very unequal parties. In return for the tribute or taxes, the suzerain, the strong king, would promise protection and would usually grant some degree of freedom for the vassal state and the smaller king. Now, this text says that in their 13th year, these 5 kings rebelled. Why did they rebel? It could be any one of several reasons or a combination of causes. Usually, though, a vassal king would prefer to be free of the bondage of owing tribute to the greater king. You see, that is wealth that could be his, that is going out of his land to the suzerain. This vassal king may look at the broader political movements and wars of his day and say, the emperor is too busy with other concerns, he's too weak to respond, now's my chance. And so he stops sending the tribute. Maybe, as in this case, he finds other vassal states that are equally tired of paying the tribute, and they all join together and rebel, saying, well, he can't take all of us, and maybe so. We'll see. It could be that they had a just cause, that the reign of Chedorlaomer was cruel and unjust, so maybe these guys were freedom fighters. Or maybe they were just proud and arrogant, greedy and foolish. We don't really know. Most likely, it was the rebellion over taxes. Imagine that. I think we as Americans can certainly relate to that somewhat with our history. We rebelled over Great Britain because of taxes to a large extent, fought a war of independence, and we were the freedom fighters. No taxation without representation was a popular saying. And so we do tend to root for the little guy against the big guy, whether it's in politics or an athletic event or in business. So I think we tend to side with the kings of Sodom and company in this one. But keep in mind, 4,000 years and an ocean separate us from the events, so we don't really know the full story, and we also know that Sodom ended up being a not-so-good place. We do know that Abram was not initially a part of the rebellion here. Okay, Abram's not even mentioned yet, so he's not a part of this tax revolt. In general, we also know that God has established the nations and governments, kings and rulers, to bring order into the world. Romans 13:1 says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." Now, I think that any rebellion against a legitimate government must be able to prove that the rebellion is in accordance with biblical principles, and that can be difficult, but not impossible. Again, we simply don't have enough data about the reign of Cheddar to know if this rebellion was good or bad. Notice also that Cheddar was not alone in waging this war. You got to ask, were these other kings allies equal with Cheddar, or were they loyal vassals, similar to Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities? Cheddar seems to be the boss in verse 4, so my guess is that Amraphel, Arioch, and Tidal were the loyal vassals, and Cheddar was the strong man. He was the emperor. So you've got these 5 vassals in the plain now that are in rebellion, and 3 who were loyal. The 3 loyal vassals would be looking to impress their suzerain with their cooperation, their loyalty, their strength, and perhaps gain more wealth because they're going to spend some money on this campaign, so maybe they'll make up their losses by taking these cities. And also, don't forget, there might be some personal grudges between these 4 kings and the 5 rebels. We just don't know. Now let's look at the conduct of the war. The year after the rebellion began, and so in general, we're looking at 2000 BC, plus or minus 100 years or so. So the year after the rebellion began, Cheddar and his loyal vassals conducted a large campaign, not just against the 5 rebels, but in the general region there. Their route, they came from the east, but the way it's phrased frequently in the Middle East is these kings came from the north, because they come from the east and then they turn south. So they're coming from the north along what is known as the King's Highway. And their first stop was against the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim. That's northeast of the Dead Sea, south of Damascus. This city was not listed as one of the 5 rebels, so this is a clue that the war by Cheddar was about more than just quelling a rebellion amongst his vassals. Ashtaroth is mentioned a few other times in the scriptures. Deuteronomy 1:4, it's mentioned as the home of Og, king of Bashan. Now this Og is mentioned again in Deuteronomy chapter 3, and there he's described as a remnant of the giants, with an iron bed that is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, and each cubit is about 18 inches long. The Rephaim are referred to as giants in the Bible, kind of like the Anakim or the Anunnaki of ancient Sumer. So how big were these giants? Well, we don't really know. The average guy back then in the Middle East at that time would be about 5'5", maybe. So the pro athletes of our day, many of whom are in the 6'6" to 7'2" range, would likely be considered giants by them. Or they could be taller, even much taller, like really tall. Giants apparently were few and poorly organized, and they didn't put up much of a resistance, it seems, and so Cheddar and company overtook them. The rest of the cities they attacked also seem to have fallen quickly. So there's no serious resistance going on here. And now that leaves the 5 cities of the plain to themselves. Now the armies of that day would be quite small, numbering in the low thousands at most, and their weapons would likely have been of bronze. They would have some supply trains, but mostly live off the land, plunder the surrounding countryside and towns. Woe be unto you if you're a farmer in the path of an invading horde of hungry Assyrians or Babylonians or whatnot. Wars were devastating to the small farmers along the route and the small villages and towns because they would have to give up everything they had to feed the hungry soldiers. And then there's nothing left for you. The cities were where the spoils were, the riches, and some grain storehouses as well. But the countryside was usually where the food was. Fruit trees and vegetables and all that. The damage caused by an invading army would last for years, maybe even decades. Some regions get basically depopulated by these kinds of wars. Because the war and the key participants just are not recorded well in ancient texts, and the modern books that I have about ancient warfare don't say much or anything about them because there's no source material. But the commentaries on Genesis also really don't say much because there's just not much source material, not enough evidence to go on. So, that the part that is we do have a lot more about is the Lot and Abraham part. Well, the 5 kings had no doubt been hearing the news about Cheddar's army pounding the surrounding cities and countryside, so they knew they were next. They chose to fight in the valley of Siddim near the Salt Sea. And that's interesting. They must have been fairly confident to face off against this army of Cheddar in a valley, a plain, that instead of retreating to the walls of their cities or to the hills, they decided, hey, let's stand together and go at them head on. Maybe the armies were of similar size. No details of the battle are given, but we do see the outcome in verse 10. The 5 kings lost. Their men fled to the hills. Some fell into the bitumen pits or tar or asphalt pits. Now, the implications of the word fell can also mean that they went into the pits on purpose, like to hide, to get away from the enemy. And apparently that ruse worked because we see the king of Sodom surviving. Because in verse 17, we see the king of Sodom greeting Abram after Abram's raid. So Abram hides, his army flees, but the people of Sodom get sacked, and Lot gets taken hostage along with many other people in Sodom. So this story though does get worse. When Cheddar's army sacks Sodom and Gomorrah, let's talk about that a little bit. When ancient cities got sacked by an enemy force, there would usually be lots of raping of women and children, murdering many in cold blood, rounding up slaves and loot to take back home. The kings and generals would get their portions, and they would have carts full of loot. But the individual soldiers would take what they could carry, which would be not much if you've got to pack that all the way back home. There's no UPS back then to ship things back home with. You had to put it on your pack and carry it. So you would look for gold or silver coins, small jewels, etc. that don't weigh much. The cities would frequently then be set on fire and destroyed wantonly. Just think of our big cities like Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis have already been laid waste, apparently. So it could take several days or even a few weeks to complete the destruction of a city. There would be dead bodies everywhere, the stench of death and smoke. The vultures would be gathering. Wild animals would come in. It would be a foul place. The cries and wailing of the women and children would fill the air. Rounding up the survivors, you wanted to take away slaves or hostages who could be ransomed back, should anyone back home want them and have the money. Lot would have been a leading citizen by then, more than likely, so he was taken hostage. And probably his wife and daughters as well, obviously. But hostages would be slaves unless they were ransomed. So they're looking at slavery in their future. The third point is the long road to slavery. Having won the war and punished their disloyal vassals and likely conquered new cities along the way, made more vassals, Cheddar's army took their provisions, their loot, and the slaves, Lot and Lot's goods, and then departed, headed back home. They would most likely return the way they had come because along the way they would have stationed some troops and supplies at various outposts or forts, and they would be in charge of rounding up more food for the army's return. And so now the farmers and villagers who had been required to contribute their animals, their fruit and produce, their grains and bread that they'd been plundered, they'd done this on the army's way originally. Well, now they get plundered again on the way back. Lucky them. Life was hard. The slaves or hostages would be forced to walk the entire way, usually chained or tied together in some way. No privacy, starvation rations, little water, no bathrooms, no showers. You are treated like cattle on a cattle drive. The women and children would be raped some more, and anyone could be beaten or killed at any time, and many would die on the journey back. It would be a journey of several weeks at least, probably a few months. Full exposure to the sun and heat, the rain and cold. So again, people are dying left and right on this trip back. Some of the women would give birth on the way. Some would get pregnant on the way by the rapes that would happen. And so many of the babies would not likely survive. They would be cast off, exposed, or they would die along the way. The entire way, you would be remembering what you had lost, who you had lost, the pain, hunger, fear, and indignities that you are currently suffering, and then your fear and dread of what lies in the future. It would be hell on earth, misery. Your life is over, slavery awaits. This is about as good of a depiction of hell as the world gives. So that was the battle of the plain and the consequences. Now let's make some application. This sad story of war is repeated thousands of times across the millennia and around the world. We live in a fallen world where cruelty, suffering, and death abound. And on a practical level, the nations that maintain their strength and that can defend against the conquering host, good for them. But that requires good leadership, good resources, good citizenry. When a people lose their edge, become soft and complacent, and allow corruption to settle in at the top, and they believe lies and deny truths, they will become vulnerable, weak, and eventually lose their freedom and become like Lot's family and neighbors. It takes hard work, diligence, strong will to make a country strong and to keep it strong. Now, does the church have a role in that? Certainly, indirectly, through making disciples, preaching the gospel, building strong families, that contributes to the strength of any society. However, the church, I believe, should also be more directly involved in the building up of the country that provides safety and protection for their members, allows and promotes flourishing. The church benefits from a strong, prosperous, and well-led nation and should recognize that and support it directly as well as spiritually and indirectly. Yet, today I see the church leaning more heavily in tearing down our country than defending her. Was Lot ready for the invasion? Were his neighbors ready? Does not look like it. Real life can throw horrible nationwide things at you that had clear warnings beforehand had you paid attention. But there was a collective failure to act here. Is the church acting like a watchman on the wall? Or are we ignoring the culture wars, ignoring international politics, choosing the wrong side in domestic politics because we are uncomfortable that one side sounds too mean, too crude? What is the dominant religion of Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Turkey, Syria, and Jordan today? Islam. Was that always the case? The answer is no. Prior to the 7th century, there were about 4 centuries where all those lands were predominantly Christian. Today, Christians are a weak, scarce minority in the Middle East. Why? Because the Roman Empire grew weak, divided, and ineffective. The church was there and prominent, but the church could not or did not stop the situation. The Roman Middle East and North Africa became so weak that the Muslims conquered it all, and the church is all but dead. That phrase, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, I disagree with that phrase. The church died in the Middle East. Died. Very little remains. Very little. Don't think that that can't happen here in America. It is currently happening across Western Europe. If the church fails to be strong and exercise its prophetic voice in a soft culture, then that culture will fail and evil will sweep in and rule with an iron fist. The church does indeed have an important role in keeping a state free and prosperous, should she decide to exercise that role. It begins with preaching the gospel, of course, but it does not end there. Spiritually, this text shows that the long war against God is still being fought, and people's souls are being taken captive. Their lives are being ruined and plundered by the enemy. God's enemies hate the church, hate Christians, and are coming for us. Will we play nice and be winsome, or will we fight back with the gospel, with prayer, the armor of God, and the weapons at our side in the political realm, the physical realm? The kings of the East want your soul, and if they cannot have your soul, they will seek to destroy you and America any way they can. Are we battle tough? Prepared spiritually and practically? Is our church training for a strong defense and offense? Next time, we'll look at Abram's response to this war. This is Stab the Dragon, in hoc signo vinces, out here.